It is difficult to measure the full weight of a kindness that someone attempts to keep hidden. Some people perform generous acts so loudly that the world cannot help but notice. Others move quietly, gently, deliberately, choosing a kind of anonymity that protects both the giver and the receiver. Michael Jackson, despite the extravagance of his public persona, belonged to the second category far more than most people ever realized. Throughout his life he lived under lights so bright that even the smallest stumble could become international scandal. Yet many of his most compassionate impulses took place in shadows he rarely allowed reporters to see. The story that emerged after his death, one particular story about an act of kindness he never claimed publicly, captured something essential about him. It began as a whisper passed from a hospital worker to a family member, then to a friend of the family, and eventually into the larger public consciousness. It was the kind of story that made people reassess the man behind the music, the man behind the controversies, the man behind the mask of fame he never quite asked for. Years earlier, when a small children's hospital in California faced a crisis, few people outside the institution even knew. Funding cuts had placed several of its programs at risk, particularly one that provided expensive long-term treatment for children with life-threatening conditions. Families who relied on the program lived in fear that the hospital would announce its closure. What they did not know was that someone had taken an interest in the situation. A donor had stepped forward with an offer substantial enough to keep the program running for years. The donor refused credit, refused any plaque, refused even a private meeting with the board. The only condition was that the gift remain anonymous. Hospital administrators were puzzled, grateful, and slightly suspicious, as anyone might be when offered a lifeline from an invisible hand. Only a very small number of people were told the donor's name, and they were instructed never to disclose it. Michael had heard about the hospital through a chance conversation. He had visited many hospitals throughout his career, often slipping in quietly to speak with children, performing songs at bedsides and signing autographs that later became treasured mementos. He understood illness because he had grown up with a complicated relationship to his own body. Injuries, exhaustion, vitiligo, surgeries, endless rehearsals. He understood, too, what it meant to be helpless in the face of circumstances outside one's control. So when he learned of this particular program and the children who depended on it, something in him responded with the urgency of someone who knew what it meant to feel unprotected. He made arrangements privately, asking lawyers to create a buffer so the donation could not be traced back to him. He wanted the children to have care, but he did not want the world to interpret the act as a publicity move, nor did he want the families to feel indebted to a celebrity. He had always been uncomfortable with the idea that people might see him as something more than human. In many ways he wanted to shrink himself, to blend in, to give without spectacle. During his visit, one that the public never knew happened, he entered the hospital disguised beneath a simple cap, glasses, and a loose jacket that blurred his silhouette. A nurse who later shared her account said she recognized him not by his appearance, but by the softness of his voice when he spoke to one of the children. He sat beside a 7-year-old girl who was recovering from a delicate procedure. She did not know who he was, and he did not tell her. They talked about her drawings, about the blue crayon she used for all the skies in her pictures. He told her that the color blue reminded him of music, which made her laugh. When the girl drifted towards sleep, he stayed a moment longer, adjusting the blanket near her feet. The nurse recalled that he whispered something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a wish, and then slipped out of the room. Michael never spoke publicly about the donation. He returned to his life, returning to studios, rehearsals, legal battles, and the constant tide of public speculation that surrounded him in the last decade of his career. To many he seemed distant, changed, scarred by years of scrutiny. Friends later said he was more tender in private, more reflective, and sometimes more sad. But generosity was woven into him. He told a friend once that kindness was the only act that helped him feel free, the only place where he could express himself without being judged or misinterpreted. He believed that giving was a form of healing, not only for others but for himself. It was only after his death that the hospital's secret donor was revealed. A long-retired administrator, no longer bound by the same obligations, mentioned it in a conversation recorded for a small documentary project about philanthropic history. His words spread quickly across the internet. The anonymous donor, the one who had kept the children's program alive, had been Michael Jackson. News outlets picked up the story. Former staff members corroborated it. A doctor who had worked on the ward remembered that a mysterious donor had also sent boxes of toys one Christmas. Expensive ones, carefully chosen, each box containing a handwritten note that simply said, "With love." Though the handwriting had been disguised, he suspected even then that it was someone well known, not because of extravagance, but because of the way the gifts had been chosen, meticulously, almost intimately, with the attention of someone who understood children deeply. Fans were both surprised and not surprised. They had long known of Michael's charitable efforts. He had supported dozens of organizations, sometimes publicly, sometimes quietly. He had visited children's hospitals in every country on tour, sometimes staying long after schedule, listening to parents and doctors, holding hands with children who were too weak to lift their heads. But this story had a different weight. It was something he had buried intentionally, something meant to exist without fame. The contrast between the secrecy of the act and the enormity of its impact shifted the way people spoke about him. It was as if the world had been given a final glimpse into the private heart of someone they thought they knew. The story reignited discussions about the complexity of fame. People wondered what it must have been like to be Michael Jackson, loved by millions, mistrusted by others, chased by journalists, endlessly dissected, and yet still yearning to do good without recognition. One journalist who revisited coverage from the late 1990 noted that Michael had often been mocked for speaking about global healing and the innocence of childhood. His words had been dismissed as naive, even eccentric. Yet here was a concrete example of his philosophy made real. Behind the spectacle, he had taken real, sustained action to protect the vulnerable. The discovery cast a different light on past interviews, particularly those in which he spoke about wanting to build a world where children never suffered. Many had rolled their eyes then, assuming such statements were merely sentimental. After the revelation, they seemed less like empty promises and more like glimpses into his deeply held values. As the story spread, families who had benefited from the hospital's program began to speak out. One mother said that her son, who survived a rare condition thanks to treatments funded during the years of Michael's anonymous support, had grown up never knowing his life had been touched by the generosity of a global icon. She said she felt grateful not only for the donation, but for the intention behind it. "He didn't want us to feel we owed him anything," she said. "He just wanted the kids to have a chance." Another parent recalled that during a particularly difficult holiday season, the program had covered treatments they could not afford. Whoever the donor was, she remembered thinking at the time, they must have known something about struggle. The revelation also introduced Michael's act of kindness to a generation too young to have known him. Young people discovering his music after his death were captivated not only by the dance moves and the spectacle, but also by stories like this, stories that offered a different lens through which to view someone who had been more myth than man to them. Teachers used the story in classrooms to demonstrate the value of private charity. Social media users circulated it with messages about giving without expecting credit. Some wondered how many other stories like this might have existed, lost to time or sealed in confidentiality agreements. For those who had known Michael personally, the story was not surprising at all. His bodyguard once recalled that Michael would often pull over the car if he saw someone who looked like they needed help. Sometimes he would hand a struggling family a wad of cash. Other times he would instruct his team to follow up and make sure the person received additional support. He never wanted pictures taken. He never wanted anyone to talk about it. Those who worked with him grew accustomed to these moments, though they sometimes struggled to comprehend the intensity of his empathy. Michael seemed to identify with anyone who was hurting, as if their pain amplified something inside him. One friend believed that this empathy was both his greatest strength and his greatest burden. After the hospital story became public, a former colleague of Michael's recounted an incident that echoed the same spirit. Years earlier, the colleague had overheard Michael speaking on the phone late at night. He was arranging to pay the funeral expenses for a child he had never met, but whose story had devastated him. When the colleague gently asked why he insisted on handling it personally, Michael replied, "I don't want them to feel alone." These small, private gestures, scattered across decades, formed a pattern, one that the world could only fully appreciate when he was no longer there to deflect the attention. As journalists dug deeper, another detail surfaced. The same hospital had reported that the children's ward received sporadic shipments of new equipment during the donor's involvement. Some of the medical devices were purchased from specialized suppliers, the kinds used in research-focused hospitals. Staff members had assumed the items came from a wealthy foundation. Learning they had been arranged by a man who was simultaneously dealing with intense legal and financial pressure startled them. It suggested something profound about his priorities. Even as he navigated his own crises, he still made room for acts of generosity that required both financial and emotional investment. This revelation created a wave of reflection among fans who had followed Michael's public philanthropic efforts. Many remembered his participation in We Are the World, his donations from concert proceeds, his creation of the Heal the World Foundation, and the countless times he visited orphanages during tours. Yet this hidden act, the decision to rescue a hospital program without ever attaching his name, felt different. It felt like something he had done not as Michael Jackson, the star, but as Michael, the human being. It painted a picture of someone who wanted to be seen not for his fame, but for his capacity to care. Even critics found themselves silent for a moment, reconsidering past narratives. Some commentators acknowledged that the world often forgets that celebrities, especially those as iconic as Michael, are capable of vulnerability and private longing. Others pointed out the irony that a man accused of seeking constant attention had secretly performed one of the most impactful charitable acts of his career. The story complicated people's perceptions, urging them to recognize the multifaceted nature of public figures whose lives are flattened by media scrutiny. The hospital's program continued for years after Michael's initial support, gaining enough visibility to attract new donors. Administrators later noted that if not for that anonymous infusion of funds, it would likely have collapsed before ever gaining the recognition it needed to survive long term. In this sense, Michael's kindness had a ripple effect far greater than its immediate impact. It became the foundation for a chain reaction of generosity that extended well beyond his lifetime. Some even argued that his anonymity helped the program thrive because it encouraged future donors to contribute without feeling overshadowed by a celebrity's involvement. In the wake of the revelation, a nurse who had worked in the ward during that period shared her own memory. She said that one evening, while adjusting an Roman IV line, she noticed a small toy on a child's bedside table, a plastic figurine with glittery wings. She asked the child where it came from, and he told her a nice man with a soft voice had given it to him. The nurse assumed it was a volunteer. Only years later did she realize what she had witnessed. She described the moment with a kind of awe, as if she had brushed against a small miracle without knowing. It reminded her, she said, that even the most famous people can have moments of pure, unguarded humanity. As people revisited Michael's interviews after the story broke, his words gained new meaning. In one conversation, he spoke about wanting to be remembered not for his records or performances, but for the difference he made in people's lives. At the time, some dismissed the statement as cliché. After learning about the hidden donation, it felt like a window into his true aspirations. He had always seemed propelled by a desire to heal, not only through his music, which often addressed themes of unity and compassion, but through direct, tangible acts. His artistry had been global, but his kindness was often intensely personal. It took place in hospital rooms, in ordinary streets, in quiet exchanges with people who never knew the full story. Even today, years after the revelation surfaced, the hospital story continues to circulate whenever discussions about Michael Jackson's legacy arise. It serves as a reminder that public narratives rarely capture the whole truth of a person's life. Fame magnifies flaws and embellishes rumors, but it can also obscure the quieter truths, the moments when someone chooses to act with dignity and generosity even when no one is watching. Michael's anonymous gift stood as evidence of this. In a world obsessed with spectacle, he found a way to perform an act of profound goodness without fanfare. Some people have speculated about why he insisted on anonymity. Those who knew him well often say he did not want to risk cynicism, that if people knew the donation was his, some would accuse him of trying to distract from negative press. Others believe he simply felt joy in the purity of giving. He had grown up in an environment where his talent was constantly assessed, where success was measured in applause and sales. Private charity, free from judgment, may have offered him a rare sense of freedom. Whatever his reasons, the result remains the same. Children who might not have survived received care, families found hope, and a program threatened by closure endured. In the years following the revelation, the story of Michael's secret kindness became a symbol for fans, a way to honor him beyond the controversies, beyond the impossible expectations, beyond the mythology that had grown around him. They spoke of it at memorials, wrote about it in blogs, and shared it on anniversaries of his passing. For them, it validated what they had always believed, that beneath the global icon was a gentle, empathetic soul who used his success not merely for personal gain, but to lift others in ways rarely seen or understood. For some, learning about the donation healed bitter feelings left by public misunderstandings of his later life. It allowed them to remember him with softness rather than sorrow. Today, when people recount the story, they often pair it with the comment that true kindness is what a person does when no one is watching. Michael Jackson, who lived a life in which nearly everyone watched, chose one of his greatest acts for a moment when no one would. In doing so, he demonstrated a truth about generosity that transcends fame. The world's recognition contributed nothing to his decision. In fact, he actively prevented it. The only recognition he seemed to seek was the quiet knowledge that children in need were receiving care. For a man often portrayed as fragile, strange, or extravagant, this quiet strength, this ability to give without calculation, revealed a grounded moral clarity that his public life often obscured. And so the story endures. Not because it changes everything about Michael Jackson, nor because it erases the complexities of his life, but because it adds dimension to a man whose humanity was too often flattened by the weight of his fame. It invites us to look past the performances and the headlines, past the light, ridden stages and glittering costumes, and to see instead the person who slipped into a hospital room wearing a cap and glasses, speaking softly to a child about the color blue. It encourages us to recognize that sometimes the most meaningful legacies are crafted not in front of millions, but in small, hidden corners of the world where someone chooses to care simply because they can. In the end, the story of Michael Jackson's secret act of kindness is not about celebrity at all. It is about the profound, unheralded impact one person can make when they follow compassion instead of applause. It is about the quiet places where love does its work. It is about the enduring truth that even in a life defined by spectacle, the greatest performances may be the ones no one ever sees.